Good morning, good evening, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever you might be doing. We wish to welcome you to the Silverlight Show. The Silverlight shines to illuminate that which lies hidden in darkness. For those of you tuning in today, we welcome you in. So the lovely scene in the background you're looking at there has a high-rise apartment. It's actually condos as far as I know, not 100% sure. But it kind of has that brutalist, minimalist architecture style that was renowned for the Soviet architecture in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And since our subject today is why the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed, I figured why not bring it up and give it one last whirl. I'll try to find some more scenes soon. The USSR was established in late 1917, early 19 through 1920. And that's because when the workers marched in and kicked the Tsar out, they had an interim government. That interim government was theoretically democratic, but it wasn't reforming things fast enough for the people who had suffered years of oppression under some incredible Tsars. Everyone from Ivan the Terrible to Catherine the Great, right up to Tsar Nicholas II. Now, Tsar Nicholas kind of gets a bum rap in the world because he would have been a good peacetime Tsar. He was already implementing substantial freedoms and he was liberalizing his government. He wasn't doing it fast enough, and unfortunately, because World War I was as brutal as it was, people saw the opportunity for revolution. Tsar Nicholas didn't have the power over the people that he thought he did, which just shows that with enough people motivated, you can make changes happen. But while the provisional government was in place, there was another government, a government that was put in there by the Germans. Yes, Lenin. Lenin was a full-blown communist revolutionary. And he'd been hounded out of the country, just like so many communist revolutionaries are. But Germany, in the hopes of destabilizing the government, put him on a train with millions of dollars, or rubles, or whatever you want to call it, in gold. They sealed the train shut, they sent it into Russia. The other end, he opened it up, got out, and he had all the money that he needed to fund his various causes. So just like last episode where we compared National Socialist Germany to the USSR, Germany once again is meddling in Russian politics. You got German philosophers with the German philosophy infiltrating Russia and turning it into a Soviet republic. Now I will say they were Soviet. They did have councils, you could get elected to councils, etc., but it wasn't very democratic and it wasn't very free. Nevertheless, Lenin knew that he had to have a modern economy. World War I had shown that the Russians simply did not have the capability of building a lot of stuff very quickly. And he started his reforms, unfortunately, and I say this hesitantly because Lenin had some pretty controversial views. But I think compared to Stalin, Lenin was a heck of a lot better leader. Lenin passed away very early in the 1920s, and Stalin had spent the 19 teens and the early 1920s becoming the general secretary for the Communist Party. What that means is he did all the jobs nobody else wanted to, and before anybody else knew what happened, he had control of the state. That meant he could use his apparatus, his control over everything, to make sure he was the one in charge. And Stalin did not suffer fools. His own son got captured by the Germans, and he didn't even intervene to save his life. That's the kind of person Stalin was. And he had a rock-hard grip on the USSR for 20 years, 30 years really. He didn't die until the 1950s, and his surgeons were so scared to go in and bother him that he basically had a stroke and no one bothered going in to check on him for almost half a day. After that, you get Khrushchev. Khrushchev tried to implement some reforms, but the problem is they've been under a one-party control for so long, it was unheard of. I mean, how do you take things from a planned economy to outright open, wide open capitalism, etc.? The fact is you can't. But what he did instead, Khrushchev tried to channel the resources into other things. He was trying to de-Stalinize the place, which means getting rid of Stalin as this icon and making, not having the secret police looking over everybody's shoulder, which is only sensible in any modern country, because people know when they're being watched. And just because this all happened in the 1950s, don't think it was easy to ditch a KGB agent that was determined to follow you. I've alluded to this before, but all you need to do is you need to go to FBI.gov. You can look up cases, and you'll be surprised how much information they have on people. I mean, Fred Chrisman, who I've referred to before, they have a 16-page report on him detailing what his high school teachers thought of the man. Like, these are people walking around, literally, these are gumshoe detectives going around, talking to people like you see in the old movies, smoking their cigars, picking up telephones, making random calls. There's no internet. There's nothing for them to do. This is hardcore detective work. And if the CIA could do it, you bet your bottom dollar the KGB could do it too. This wasn't a bad thing, though, because they were absorbing technology from Germany. They were modernizing their factories. They're actually able to keep going almost right into the 1970s before the inherent weakness of their system showed. And the problem in the Russian economy has always been rubles were never allowed to be traded on the foreign market. Russia was socialist, so rubles were intended to try and be more representative of a person's work than is over here in the Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic world. This means when they went to pay for commodities, they had to trade commodity for commodity. And one thing that the Soviet Union had was oil. They had it in spades. One of the reasons that Germany invaded them was simply so that they could get a hold of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics oil fields. That would have been a catastrophic blow for Stalin. And it would have been a catastrophic blow for the world if Hitler had access to that much oil. But Russia was selling that, and that's how they would make their money, is they would be able to trade oil, and that way they'd be able to say, okay, we're not dealing with American imperialist pig dog propaganda. We are dealing in raw resources, and we trade resources for resources. Now, this had a couple of effects. One thing is we know that a resource exporting economy always has a finite life in it. That finite life can come from a couple things. You can either run out of said resource, which is catastrophic. Banana republics, for example. Banana republics, back in the 1950s, the Gros Michel banana had a plague go through it. So they had to switch to the modern Cavendish banana, which is why when you eat banana-flavored anything, it tastes different. Well, this caused a lot of people to lose their lives, lose their homes, lose everything, and because they specialized in nothing but the cultivation of the Gros Michel banana. By Russia, depending mostly on oil exports, and number two was their defense industry, and you think about that for a minute. Russian MiGs were everywhere. Russian tanks were everywhere. The AK-47 is ubiquitous as a weapon around the world. But even despite all those weapon sales going to all sorts of places, they still needed people to take their oil. As an example, One of the big things in Russia was Pepsi. In the World's Fair in 1969, I believe it is, one of the Pepsi executives managed to get a shot of the Russian premier at the time, I forget who it was, and the American president, who I believe was Richard Nixon, holding a can of Pepsi together. He got that shot, and all of a sudden Russians wanted some Pepsi. So the Soviet Union was willing to trade Pepsi for things like vodka, which, of course, Russia had a lot of. This all went very well while Russia was able to maintain their economy. But during the 70s and the 80s, it was starting to show that a command economy wasn't really able to respond to the modern world. I mean, think of the Christmas toy season. Every year, there's one toy that comes out of nowhere, and every kid just simply must have the latest toy. It's the most important thing ever. Mommy and Daddy, can I please have whatever the thing is? And supplies go through the roof. Good example of this would be Cabbage Patch Dolls. Remember, well, if you're old enough, do you remember how they went nuts for them? If you're a little younger than that, maybe you remember Pogs. People went absolutely nuts for them. They had to get them in any way, shape, or form. And nobody remembers these things. Well, they remember them, but they have little or no value today. But at the time, they were worth people were jumping over each other, paying all sorts of money to try to get them off each other. But the Soviet economy wasn't able to do that. Because it was a planned economy, they had 5-year plans on the economy. So they would be saying, okay, right now, we're in 2021 as of the recording of this broadcast. So we would have set down our plan in 2020, and we'd be looking now towards accomplishing our 2022 targets, knowing that in 2025 we're going to get new targets, new something. There's no real ability in there to say, oh, wait, we've just discovered kids really like, what do you call that stuff that they play with? Muck, gack, whatever. Anyway, they really like that. We need to make a whole bunch of it. Well, there's no place for that in the Soviet command economy because it wasn't communist. It wasn't being run by the people for the people. It wasn't power to the people. It was power to the very few people that control all the rest of the people. Like I said, this really started to show in the 70s and 80s and beginning of the 90s. The Russians simply were not able to keep up. Their designs were perfectly functional, and they still are. The Russians always prioritize reliability and durability. So you still see some countries flying MiG-21s. You still see tons of countries using AK-47s, because you know what? They're tough, they're durable. You can leave one alone, pick it up a year from now, and it's still going to work. Quite a difference to the Western approach, which is to have these high-performance aircraft that, need $35,000 per flight hour and a whole team of technicians poring over the airframe. I mean, the Russians on the United States and its allies' air bases, every day they do a foreign object sweep, which means you get a whole line of troops going up and down, and every time they see a rock or a stone or whatever, they pick it up, put it in a bag, throw it away, whatever, to keep that airway clean. The Russians have a very simple switch that changes the air intakes from the scoops on the side that are used for high performance to ones on the top. Very practical. Adds a little bit of weight to the unit, but at the same token, you can take off from almost any runway. And we know, thanks to the United States, that the first target in any kind of war is going to be the runways. So again, the Russians are extremely practical. The Soviets have had this design philosophy forever. The problem is they don't have the agility. The United States could turn around tomorrow and say, we're making brand new satellite lasers. And the Soviet Union would have taken 5 years to respond. That's why the Americans were able to field the space shuttle in the 1970s, and it took the Russians until nearly the 1990s to put a working one together. The Soviet space shuttle was superior in almost every aspect. It could carry more cargo. It was automated. Like, it did take advantage of the new technology that had come out in the 10 years previous. That being said, some people think it was a copy. It wasn't. It's just there's one way to make a space plane, and the Soviets always had limited computing power. I visited a former Soviet nation in 2002. At that time, they were just getting Pentium 1s over there. And at that time, I forget what number of Pentium we were on, but we were dramatically advanced. And they were bragging about this new computer, how fantastic it was. I'm like, geez, this thing is so obsolete. But they were pleased to have it. So if you don't have the ability to manage your information and to manage your economy so that it can change, what if the world went up or down in temperature by 5 degrees? It doesn't sound like a lot, but it means either ice caps would melt or ice caps would spread. And if that happens, you would need instantly to be able to start producing more fur coats, more swim equipment, whatever it might be. And what if the world was hit by a pandemic? The Soviet Union would have had to rely on foreign charity for that because their industries were all busy meeting their targets. So the collapse came when the United States, the United Kingdom, and France decided they were going to attack Russia's economic base. And this led to them drilling a whole bunch of oil platforms. This was expensive. This took a lot of money, but at the same token, it lowered the price of fuel. And when that price lowered, Russia was no longer to trade its goods for anything, for the same amount that they were being traded at before. Eventually, this meant that the Soviets simply didn't have the resources to keep their economy going because they were still trying to have a 5-year growth plan, but the resources coming in were shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And eventually, the government just flat out collapsed. They couldn't pay themselves, they couldn't pay each other, and that's it. The lineups became long, and they went through what's called the Velvet Revolution, which I like, because there were some incidents of violence, like tearing down the Berlin Wall, and some statues of Stalin and Lenin got vandalized. I don't really understand why people want to destroy statues. I mean, sorry, I'm a history major, economic minor, and I just don't see destroying a statue. Yes, some people did hideous things, but I'd rather spend another $100, put a plaque beside it says, by the way, these are the bad things about this person, stick it there. Whereas tearing it down, all you've done is just ruin something. And I'm thinking specifically of all the archaeological sites in the world that have been destroyed. But that's just me. Now, what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed? This is where life gets interesting. See, my economic paper that I wrote for my final economics class dealt specifically with what happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, the Soviet Union, they had to keep their people employed, so they had sports clubs. And I don't mean like, the Toronto Argonauts or the Washington no-name football team or the Seattle Seahawks or the Miami Dolphins. They literally had sports teams where it would be your local neighborhood's basketball club. And you'd have people in there from like 20 years old to 60 years old that would, basically play basketball in exchange for some food to eat and a roof over their head. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there wasn't money going to these organizations anymore. These people all had to find work. And all they'd done all their life was work out and compete and get ready. You might want to look in history about how the Soviet Union was one of the dominant forces in sports. And that's simply because they invested a lot of money into sports because it was viewed as an admirable activity. It kept people's bodies busy. It kept their minds busy. So, they were busy. They weren't bothering anybody else. It was a good investment for the government. When the Soviet Union fell, all these people suddenly had nowhere to work. But who did have money and who could afford to pay them was the Russian mafia. So all of a sudden the Russian mafia has all this muscle. These big guys who are looking to prove themselves and who are getting paid. And it's a good symbiotic unity. Now they can all of a sudden extend their tendrils and start saying, hey, it's not just me and my brother, Boris, but we also have Vladimir and, whatever from the local sports arena. You've watched them box, so you should give us some protection money. What they call a roof. Roof meaning that you're protected. And the Russian mafia is so well organized that even if two different gangs are in the territory and the one gang comes to you and say, oh, I'm protected by Boris, that other gang will call Boris up. Hey, Boris, you heard of the Silverlight family? And Boris says, I've heard of them, but they're not my clients. And then both gangs are going to come back and make sure you know not to use their name like that again. So the 1990s was a very turbulent time for the USSR/Russia. The interesting thing is, because the system had been running poorly for so long, the people were used to it. They were used to having to line up to buy bread. They were used to having to line up to get a wall carpet, to get a bed, whatever it is. They were used to it. So they developed survival techniques. They would have kitchen gardens where they grow herbs, spices, tomatoes, potatoes, you name it all. You can do a lot in your kitchen. This is why I say we can learn from this period in history. And another interesting thing is that we have this idea that the Russians, all they did during that period was lie around at home and drink vodka. That's not true. A lot of them were still going to work. A lot of them were happy to go to work. The buses still ran, even though people weren't getting paid, because that's what the people needed. That's what they had to do. One of the more comical things during this time is that the Russian power company was hooked up to some Soviet nuclear submarines, because while they're in port, they still need power to keep everything going. And because the Russian military was behind on its bills, the Russian power machines, the Russian power people said they were going to cut off power to the nuclear submarines. It took a general walking into their office saying, do you have any idea what's going to happen if you cut off power to a nuclear submarine? Before they realized, oh yeah, this is why capitalism is heartless and stupid at times. Because anybody with a gram of sense would know, hey, let's not cut the Russian Navy off from the electrical grid just because it might have some bad effects. Maybe. Pepsi, you might recall I mentioned them. Pepsi actually acquired one of the biggest naval fleets in the world. Because the Russians, when they ran out of money to trade for Pepsi, they started giving them old decommissioned vessels. Now, Pepsi took them and broke them up into scrap, but for a little while, Pepsi controlled one of the biggest navies in the world, just of old Soviet warships that they had nothing to do with other than scrap them. But at least Pepsi got their money. See, vodka, unfortunately, is only so much vodka you can sell, whereas Coke and Pepsi, you can pretty much go to any event and sell those. I can't think of an event that you couldn't sell them, but I'm probably sure somewhere out there there's something. So in the end result, the USSR went through this dramatic explosion in growth under the hands of some pretty dictatorial people, which was great until they reached that level of modernization where a command economy simply does not work. And the people start to demand more and more. And this is why I think China is a very interesting situation. They have some free economic zones where they exchange with the West, they do all sorts of things, but they have a lot more people who are not in those free economic zones and who are busy being teachers and farmers and stuff like that. While the Chinese government is still strong, they're also a lot younger, even now, than the Soviet Union was. They're having this new influx of cash from all the nations that are working with them, but the Chinese economy is still heavily dependent on resource imports. They import a lot of oil. They import computer chips more than they export. They import a lot more computer chips, integrated circuits as they're called. So that trade imbalance is a little bit scary in my opinion. When the Soviet Union fell, all of a sudden everybody had to panic to help them find where their nuclear weapons were, because the Soviet Union and China both rely on a strategy where their nuclear missiles are mobile. They're on trucks, they're on railroads, they're all over the place. So if that happened in China, let's look at some of China's neighbors. India, Pakistan, who's allied with them. Remember, Pakistan is friends with both the United States and with China. And Pakistan is also a nuclear power. So I always find it interesting that they were hiding bin Laden on their soil. Because technically, that meant that Al Qaeda was always within arm's reach of a bomb. Just some food for thought there. The end result being the Soviet Union collapsed basically because it was a resource exporting economy. Despite the fact it didn't use money, it did direct trades. When that resource started to decrease in value, then they had no choice but to close up shop and undergo a velvet revolution. It's a lot to unpack in there, but that's where I want to leave the communism and socialism series for now. The death of communism, the rise of the Russian mafia, and boy, could I talk forever about the Russian mafia and all the things they did. But that's a story for another time. There's too much happening in the world. So I leave you with this. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you all have a fantastic day.